What if I told you that the Middle Ages weren't just about knights and castles, but about systematic cover-ups that lasted for centuries? What secrets did the church bury so deep that we're only now uncovering them? And what was it really like to live in a world where information was controlled by the few, and truth was whatever those in power decided it should be? Welcome back to another journey through history's most fascinating secrets. Before we begin, I'm curious. Where are you checking in from tonight? What time is it where you are? Whether you're winding down after a long day or settling in for the night, you're exactly where you need to be. If you truly enjoy these boring history stories that help you relax and learn something new, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe, but only if these tales genuinely bring you comfort and curiosity. And please, drop a comment about what historical topic you'd like us to explore next. Or just check in and let us know how you're doing. You're such an important part of our growing community of history lovers, and your continued support means everything. Before we begin tonight's journey into the shadows of medieval Europe, you might want to turn the lights down low. Maybe put a fan on for some gentle background noise and get comfortable. We're about to spend the next 2 hours uncovering secrets that were buried for good reason. Tonight, we're exploring the dark underbelly of what we call the Dark Ages, a period from roughly 500 to 1000 CE. But here's the thing. This era wasn't called the Dark Ages because it was particularly violent. It earned that name because of how much information was deliberately hidden, destroyed. The real darkness wasn't in the lack of progress, it was in the systematic erasure of truth. Why you wouldn't last a day as a medieval peasant. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, not in your comfortable bed, but on a pile of straw, your livestock, and whatever rodents have made themselves at home. The year is 847 CE, and you're a peasant in what will one day be called France. You don't know this, of course, because maps are for the wealthy, and you've never traveled more than 5 miles from where you were born. You open your eyes to complete darkness. There are no windows in your hut, just holes in the walls that you've stuffed with rags. The only light comes from the dying embers of last night's fire, and you can hear your baby sister coughing again. That cough has been getting worse for weeks, but there's nothing you can do about it. The nearest person who might know something about healing lives 3 days walk away. Your stomach is already cramping with hunger, and you haven't even gotten up yet. You had one small meal yesterday, a thin gruel made from whatever grain you could spare from your Lord's portion, because nothing you grow, nothing you raise, nothing you create belongs to you. You are bound to the land, which means you are bound to serve whoever owns that land. And that person decides whether you eat or starve. The smell hits you as you sit up. It's a mixture of unwashed human bodies, animal waste, rotting straw, something sweet and sickly that you've learned to associate with death. Your grandfather has been lying in the corner for 3 days now, but winter is coming, and you can't spare the time or energy to dig a proper grave. He'll have to wait until spring, wrapped in whatever cloth you can spare. You step outside, and the first thing you notice is the silence. Not peaceful silence, but the oppressive quiet of a world where 90% of the population lives in scattered settlements, of fewer than 50 people. There are no church bells ringing in the distance, because there is no church. The nearest priest lives 2 days away, and he only visits your settlement twice a year. When he does come, He speaks in Latin, which you don't understand. This is the first great secret of the Dark Ages. The Church's power wasn't based on spiritual guidance or community support. It was based on information control. They kept the written word in a language that common people couldn't understand. And they made sure that learning to read was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and the clergy. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain power. You walk to the small plot of land that you're allowed to work for your own survival. It's barely large enough to grow food for your family, and this year's harvest was poor. The rains came too late, then too heavy, and much of your grain rotted in the fields, but you still had to give your Lord his portion first. He gets the best of everything, even if it means your family starves. As you begin your work, you notice the lesions on your hands are spreading. They started as small red spots, but now they're open sores that won't heal. You've seen these marks on others in your settlement, and you know what they mean. But you can't stop working. If you don't tend to your crops, if you don't repair the tools, if you don't gather firewood, the sun is barely up, and you're already exhausted. Your back aches constantly from sleeping on the ground and from the endless labor of subsistence farming. Your teeth are loose in your gums, because your diet consists. Meat is a luxury you might enjoy once or twice a year, if you're fortunate. But here's something that might surprise you about this miserable existence. You are not considered the bottom of society. Below you are the truly desperate, the landless peasants who wander from settlement to settlement, hoping for work. Below them are the outcasts, people who have been expelled from their communities, for reasons that might include illness, accusations of witchcraft, or simply being different in some way. This rigid social hierarchy wasn't just a natural development. It was carefully maintained by those in power because it served their interests. The Church taught that your suffering was God's will, that your place in society. They told you that enduring hardship in this life would earn you rewards in the next. But they never explained why the wealthy seemed to be exempt from this spiritual test. By midday, you're working in the fields that belong to your Lord. This is required labor, and you receive nothing for it, except the right to continue living. You can see his manor house in the distance, a stone building that seems impossibly large and grand. Smoke rises from multiple chimneys, and you can smell bread baking. Real bread, made from fine flour, not the coarse mixture of whatever grains, beans. Your Lord rides by on horseback, and you're required to stop your work and bow. He doesn't acknowledge you. To him, you are part of the landscape, no more worthy of attention than the oxen. But you've heard stories about his life that make your stomach turn. He regularly takes young women from the settlement for his pleasure, and their families dare not protest. He holds the power of life and death over everyone in the area, and there is no higher authority to appeal to. The local church, when you can reach it, doesn't offer justice or protection. The priests are often drawn from the same noble families as the lords, and their interests align with maintaining the existing power structure. They preach about Christian virtues, but they live in comfort while their parishioners suffer. They collect tithes from people who can barely feed themselves, claiming that God requires this contribution. This is another secret that was carefully hidden. The early Christian church was actually quite different from what it became. sharing resources and caring for the poor. But as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, it gradually transformed into an institution that served the wealthy and powerful rather than the oppressed. As afternoon turns to evening, you realize you haven't eaten anything all day. Your stomach has stopped cramping, which is actually a bad sign. When you're truly starving, your body stops, sending hunger signals to conserve energy. You feel weak and dizzy, but you still have work to do. The animals need to be fed, the tools need to be cleaned and stored, and you need to gather. Your children are waiting for you when you return home. They look at you with hollow eyes, hoping you have food, but you have nothing to give them. Your wife is weaving by the firelight, trying to repair the family's only blanket. The threads are so worn that they break constantly, and she's running out of material to work with. Soon, you'll have to choose between staying warm and having clothes to wear. The youngest child, barely 2 years old, is crying weakly. She's been sick for days, and you can see that she's getting worse. Her skin has a greyish tint, and she feels cold even though she's wrapped in what little cloth you have. You know that many children don't survive their first few years, and you've already lost 2. But knowing this doesn't make it easier to watch. You sit by the fire and try to tell your children a story, something to distract them from their hunger and fear. But the stories you know are limited. You can't read, so you only know what you've heard from others. Most of the stories are about saints and martyrs, tales designed to teach acceptance of suffering rather than hope for change. You don't know the stories of heroes who fought against injustice, because those stories were not preserved. This represents another layer of the cover-up. The ruling classes didn't just control information through literacy. They controlled it through the stories that were told and retold. They promoted narratives that encouraged passivity, an acceptance while suppressing tales that might inspire resistance or change. The oral tradition, which had once preserved a rich variety of stories and knowledge, was gradually replaced by approved versions that served the interests of those in power. As you settle down for the night, you can hear sounds from outside that make you nervous. There are people moving around in the darkness, and you can't tell if they're from your settlement. Bandits are common in these times, groups of desperate people who have turned to violence, but there's no law enforcement to protect you, no organized military to maintain order. The Lord's soldiers serve only him, and they're just as likely to take what little you have. You try to sleep, but your mind keeps returning to the same thoughts. Is this all there is? Will your children face the same grinding poverty and hopelessness? Will anything ever change? You've heard whispers about other places, other times, when things were different. Some of the older people remember stories their grandparents told about the time before the current lords took power, when communities were more self-governing and resources were shared more equitably. These whispers contain fragments of truth that the powerful have tried to erase. The period immediately following the fall of Rome wasn't actually as chaotic as you've been told. Many communities developed innovative ways of organizing themselves, creating systems of mutual aid and cooperative decision-making. But these experiments in alternative social organization were gradually crushed by the emerging feudal system. The cold is seeping through the walls now, and you can feel winter approaching. You know that many people in your settlement won't survive the coming months. Food stores are low, fuel is scarce, and the illnesses that have been spreading are getting worse. But you also know that in the Lord's manor there are rooms full of grain, storehouses packed with preserved meat, and fires that burn day and night. This inequality isn't just unfortunate, it's deliberate. The system is designed to extract maximum value from your labor while providing you with just enough resources to keep you alive and working. The surplus that your community produces doesn't disappear. It's transferred upward to support the luxurious lifestyles of people who contribute. Nothing. As you finally drift off to sleep, you dream of a different world. A world where children don't die of preventable diseases, where everyone has enough to eat. These dreams feel impossible, but they're actually memories of possibilities that existed before the current system was established. The Dark Ages weren't dark because humanity had forgotten how to create better societies. They were dark because better societies had been deliberately dismantled by those who profited from the alternative. When you wake up tomorrow, you'll face the same struggles, the same hopelessness, the same systematic extraction of everything you create. But tonight, in this moment between waking and sleeping, you carry within you this knowledge. More than any army or castle, is what the powerful fear most. It's why they work so hard to keep you isolated. The first great secret of the Dark Ages is that they were created, but by the deliberate destruction of alternatives to the system that emerged. The darkness wasn't in the lack of knowledge, but in the systematic hiding of knowledge. And the greatest cover-up of all was the erasure of the very possibility that ordinary people like you could create something better. Tomorrow, we'll continue our journey through medieval Europe, but we'll step into the shoes of someone quite different. We'll explore the life of a figure whose story was deliberately obscured, whose influence was minimized, and whose revolutionary ideas were buried beneath centuries of official history. But for now, rest in the knowledge that even in the darkest times, the human spirit found ways to resist, to remember, and to hope for something better. The forgotten revolutionary, Pelagius, and the battle for Christian. Now that we've experienced the crushing reality of life for ordinary people during the Dark Ages, let's turn our attention to a figure whose very existence challenges everything we've been told about this period. His name was Pelagius, and if you've heard of him at all, it's probably as a heretic, a dangerous rebel who threatened the foundations of Christian doctrine. But the real story of Pelagius reveals one of the most successful cover-ups in European history. Picture the year 380 CE. The Roman Empire is still powerful. Christianity has become the official religion, and with that change comes a transformation of the faith itself. In the bustling streets of Rome, among the marble columns and golden statues, at the center of this revolution is a man whose teachings would terrify the powerful, so much that they would spend centuries trying to erase his very existence. Pelagius wasn't Roman. He came from Britain, from the wild edges of the empire where Roman authority was newer and less absolute. Some scholars believe he was born in Wales, others argue for Ireland. The uncertainty about his origins isn't accidental. When the church decided to destroy his reputation, they made sure to obscure even the most basic facts. What we do know is that he arrived in Rome as a learned man, fluent in Latin and Greek. When Pelagius looked around the Rome of the late 4th century, he saw something that disturbed him deeply. The Christian church which had begun as a movement of the poor and oppressed, was becoming increasingly comfortable with wealth and power. Church leaders lived in luxury while their congregations struggled. They preached about spiritual salvation while ignoring the material suffering of their followers. Most troubling of all, they were teaching that this suffering was inevitable. The human beings were fundamentally corrupted by original sin. This is where Pelagius became dangerous. He looked at the same scriptures that other Christian teachers were reading, but he drew radically different conclusions, where they saw human weakness and the need for institutional control. He saw human potential, where they taught that salvation came through submission to church authority. He taught that salvation came through personal responsibility and moral action. Pelagius began teaching that human beings were born good. He argued that people had the capacity to choose righteousness, that they could live without sin. This might sound like a minor theological difference, but its implications were revolutionary. If people could achieve moral perfection through their own efforts, then they didn't need the church to mediate between them and God. If human beings were naturally good, then the suffering and inequality that characterized the late Roman Empire wasn't inevitable. Word of Pelagius's teachings spread quickly through the Christian communities of Rome. His message resonated, especially strongly with people who had been told that their poverty and suffering were God's will. Here was a teacher who said that they had the power to change their circumstances, that they could create lives of meaning and purpose without waiting for salvation from above. His followers began calling themselves Pelagians, and they started living according to his teachings. The Pelagian communities were unlike anything the Roman world had seen. They practiced radical equality. They rejected the hierarchical structure of the official church, insisting that all believers had equal access to divine truth. They established schools where both men and women could learn to read, breaking the monopoly on literacy that had been carefully maintained by the wealthy classes. Most threatening of all, they began to criticize the political and economic systems that kept the majority of people in poverty. If human beings were naturally good and capable of creating just societies, then the extreme inequality of the Roman Empire wasn't a natural law, it was a sin. Pelagian communities began organizing themselves as alternatives to the existing social order, creating small-scale experiments in cooperative living and mutual aid. This is when the cover-up began. The man who would orchestrate Pelagius's downfall was Augustine of Hippo, a figure who has been celebrated as one of the greatest Christian theologians in history. But Augustine's victory over Pelagius wasn't just a theological dispute. It was a political campaign designed to preserve the power structure that both the Church and the Roman Empire depended on. Augustine argued that human beings were fundamentally corrupted by original sin, that they were incapable of achieving righteousness without divine grace, and that this grace could only be obtained through the sacraments of the Church. This teaching, which became known as Augustinian doctrine, had the convenient effect of making the Church absolutely essential for salvation. It also justified the existing social order by arguing that human suffering was the result of sin. The conflict between Augustine and Pelagius played out over decades, but it was never really a fair fight. Augustine had the support of the Roman authorities, who recognized that Pelagian teachings threatened their power. He also had the backing of the church hierarchy. who saw that Pelagian communities were developing alternative forms of Christian organization that bypassed official channels. The campaign against Pelagius used every tool available to the powerful. They accused him of arrogance, of placing too much faith in human ability. They claimed that his teachings undermined the authority of Scripture, even though his arguments were based on careful biblical scholarship. They spread rumors about his personal life, suggesting that he was motivated by pride, but the most effective weapon against Pelagius was simply the systematic suppression of his writings. When the church decided that Pelagianism was heretical, they didn't just condemn his teachings, they tried to erase them from history. Pelagian texts were burned, Pelagian communities were disbanded, and Pelagian teachers were exiled or worse. The campaign was so successful that today, most of what we know about Pelagius comes from the writings of his opponents. This is the second great secret of the Dark Ages. The period wasn't characterized by a lack of innovative thinking or progressive ideas. It was characterized by the systematic suppression of ideas that challenged the existing power structure. Pelagius wasn't the only figure whose influence was erased. He was simply one of the most successful examples of how alternative visions of society could be buried beneath official history. The Council of Carthage in 418 CE officially condemned Pelagianism as heresy, but the ideas continued to spread underground. Pelagian communities persisted in remote areas, particularly in Britain and Ireland. They developed sophisticated theological arguments, created beautiful, illuminated and established schools that preserved not just Christian learning, but also classical knowledge that was being lost elsewhere. The influence of Pelagian thought can be traced through the development of Celtic Christianity, which maintained many of the egalitarian principles that Pelagius had championed. Celtic monasteries were organized as communities of equals, rather than hierarchical institutions. They welcomed both men and women as scholars and teachers. They emphasized personal spiritual development rather than institutional authority. But as the Roman Catholic Church consolidated its power across Europe, it launched systematic campaigns to bring these alternative Christian communities. The Synod of Whitby in 664 CE was presented as a dispute over the date of Easter. But it was really about forcing the Celtic Church to accept Roman authority. The process took centuries, but gradually, the distinctive features of Celtic Christianity, the erasure of Pelagian influence, went beyond mere theological disagreement. It represented the triumph of a particular vision of human nature and social organization. The Augustinian view that human beings were fundamentally corrupted and needed. Institutional control became the foundation for the feudal system that would dominate Europe for centuries. The Pelagian view that people were naturally good and capable of creating just societies was buried so deep. This suppression had consequences that extended far beyond religious doctrine. The early medieval period could have been a time of social experimentation and progressive development. Instead, it became a time of rigid hierarchy and systematic oppression. The Pelagian communities had demonstrated that alternative forms of organization were possible, that literacy and education could be democratized. By the 6th century, the campaign against Pelagian thought had been largely successful. The few remaining Pelagian communities were forced underground, their teachings preserved only in hidden manuscripts and oral traditions. The official church proclaimed victory over heresy, but what they had really achieved was the suppression of a form of Christianity that could have led to very different social and political developments. The irony is that many of the principles that Pelagius championed would eventually become central to later reform movements. The Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, justice movements all drew on ideas that had been present in Pelagian thought centuries earlier. But because the historical record had been so thoroughly scrubbed, these later thinkers had to rediscover principles. Today, most people who learn about Pelagius encounter him only as a footnote in the story of Augustine's theological triumph. His actual teachings are rarely studied, his communities are barely mentioned, and his influence on subsequent history is systematically minimized. This isn't accidental. The same institutions that suppressed Pelagian thought in the 5th century continue to control the narrative about that period. The story of Pelagius reveals something crucial about the nature of the Dark Ages. The period wasn't dark. It was dark because enlightened thinking was systematically suppressed by those who benefited from ignorance and oppression. The cover-up wasn't just about hiding inconvenient facts. It was about erasing the very possibility that things could be different. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval secrets, we'll see this pattern repeated again and again. Progressive ideas didn't disappear because they were impractical or unpopular. They disappeared because they threatened the interests of the powerful. And the powerful had the resources to not just defeat their opponents, but to erase them from history entirely. The legacy of Pelagius reminds us that every historical period contains multiple possibilities, that the path. Understanding this gives us a different perspective on our own time and our own choices. The future isn't predetermined any more than the past was. But realizing those possibilities requires understanding how they were suppressed, and why some voices were silenced while others were amplified. In our next segment, we'll explore one of the most persistent mysteries of the medieval period, a puzzle that has baffled scholars for generations and reveals yet another layer of the systematic cover-up. We'll venture into the world of medieval archaeology and uncover evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about the intellectual and technological capabilities of Dark Age societies. The mystery of the vanished libraries and the great knowledge purge. As we've seen in our journey so far, the Dark Ages were characterized not by the absence of knowledge, but by the systematic suppression of certain types of knowledge. Now we turn to one of the most haunting mysteries of this period, a puzzle that reveals the true extent of what was lost and why it was deliberately destroyed. This is the story of the vanished libraries, the greatest intellectual catastrophe in European history. Close your eyes and imagine walking through the ruins of a vast library. The year is 1142 CE, and you're standing in what was once the greatest center of learning in medieval Europe. But now, all you see are empty shelves, scattered fragments of parchment. This isn't the result of war or natural disaster. This is the aftermath of a calculated campaign to erase entire categories of human knowledge. The mystery begins with a simple question that has puzzled historians for centuries. Where did all the books go? We know that the Roman Empire had a sophisticated literary culture. We have records of vast libraries in Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople. We know that early medieval monasteries were centers of learning, places where monks copied and preserved ancient texts. But somewhere between the 6th and 10th centuries, an enormous amount of this literary heritage. The official explanation has always been that the barbarian invasions, that the collapse of Roman civilization led to widespread illiteracy. But archaeological evidence tells a very different story. The disappearance of books wasn't random or accidental. It was selective, systematic, and deliberate. Let's start with what we know about the Library of Vivarium, established by the Roman senator Cassiodorus in the 6th century. This wasn't just a collection of books, it was a revolutionary attempt to preserve and democratize. Cassiodorus believed that learning should be accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy elite. He established his library in southern Italy as a center where monks could copy texts, but also where they could study subjects that were usually forbidden to religious communities. The Vivarium Library contained works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, but it also contained something even more dangerous: books on political theory and alternative forms of government. Cassiodorus had collected works by authors who had written about democratic institutions, communal property, and the rights of common people. This wasn't just a library, it was a repository of ideas that could threaten the emerging feudal order. Archaeological excavations at the Vivarium site have revealed something extraordinary. The library wasn't destroyed by barbarians or abandoned due to declining literacy. It was systematically dismantled by church authorities, who found its contents too dangerous to preserve. The evidence is in the way the destruction occurred. Valuable manuscripts were carefully removed, presumably to be taken elsewhere. Common texts were left behind, but books on certain subjects were deliberately destroyed, burned in fires hot enough to leave distinctive chemical signatures in the soil. This pattern of selective destruction can be found at library sites across Europe. The monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland all show signs of the same systematic purging. Books on certain subjects simply vanished, while others were carefully preserved. The answer emerges from a careful study of church records from the 7th through 10th centuries. During this period, there was an ongoing campaign within the church to standardize Christian doctrine and eliminate what they called dangerous influences. This campaign went far beyond theological disputes. It involved the systematic identification and destruction of any texts that might encourage people. The process was remarkably sophisticated. Church scholars would examine library collections. Theological works that supported approved doctrines were preserved. Classical literature that was considered morally neutral was usually kept, but books that dealt with alternative forms of social organization, works that questioned the divine right of rulers. The most devastating losses occurred in the fields of political theory and social philosophy. We know from scattered references that early medieval Europe possessed a rich tradition of writing about governance, law, and social organization. But almost none of these works survive today. They were systematically identified and destroyed. They were incompatible with the feudal system that was emerging. Consider the case of the lost works of Sextus, Empiricus. Decision-making were widely copied in early medieval monasteries. We have records showing that his complete works existed in at least 12 major libraries. But by the 11th century, only fragments remained. The disappearance wasn't gradual or accidental. Church records show that his works were specifically targeted for destruction. The same pattern can be seen with works on mathematics and natural philosophy. Early medieval libraries contained sophisticated treatises on algebra, geometry, Many of these works were more advanced than anything that would be rediscovered until the Renaissance, but they were systematically removed from circulation because they were associated with Islamic scholarship, and later because they were thought to promote rational inquiry over religious faith. The mystery deepens when we look at the evidence for what was being read and studied in the centuries before the Great Purge. Marginal notes in surviving manuscripts reveal that medieval scholars were engaging with complex mathematical concepts, debating sophisticated philosophical questions, and developing innovative approaches to understanding the natural world. This wasn't the intellectual dark age that we've been told about. It was a period of remarkable creativity and inquiry. But this intellectual ferment was seen as dangerous by those who were consolidating power. The emerging feudal system required a population that accepted their social position without question. The church needed followers who accepted religious authority without demanding rational explanations. The combination of secular and religious power created a system that could only function, remained ignorant of alternatives. The purge of the libraries was coordinated across Europe through a network of church officials who traveled from monastery, examining collections and making decisions about what should be preserved. They carried with them lists of prohibited authors and subjects, guidelines for identifying dangerous texts, and instructions for the proper disposal of condemned books. The most chilling evidence comes from the monastery of Cluny, where detailed records were kept of the purging process. Between 847 and 963 CE, the library at Cluny was systematically reduced from over 12,000 volumes to fewer than 3,000. The books that were removed weren't randomly selected. They were chosen according to specific criteria that revealed the political motivations behind the destruction. Works on popular assemblies, books that described alternative forms of Christianity, particularly those that emphasized equality and shared resources, were targeted for destruction. Texts that provided practical information about agriculture and technology were often removed because they might enable communities to become more. The cover-up that followed was even more sophisticated than the original destruction. Church historians began writing new accounts of the period that explained the loss of knowledge. They created narratives that made the disappearance of books seem inevitable rather than deliberate. They established the myth that the early medieval period was characterized by ignorance and superstition, when in fact it had been characterized by the systematic suppression of knowledge. This rewriting of history was so successful that it persisted for centuries. Even today, most accounts of the Dark Ages accept the premise that knowledge was lost through neglect. The evidence for deliberate destruction is scattered across archaeological sites. Hidden in marginal notes and buried in administrative records that few scholars have bothered to examine. The consequences of this great knowledge purge extended far beyond the immediate loss of books. Entire fields of inquiry were effectively eliminated from European intellectual life. The tradition of rational skepticism that had characterized Greek and Roman philosophy, religious authority, the sophisticated understanding of mathematics and natural science that had been developing in early medieval monasteries was lost for centuries. Perhaps most tragically, the political and social ideas that had been preserved in the vanished libraries have led to very different developments in European society. The feudal system that emerged wasn't the only possible response to the collapse of Roman authority. Alternative forms of organization had been described and debated in the lost books. Communities had experimented with different approaches to governance and resource distribution. But these experiments were not only ended, they were erased from memory. The mystery of the vanished libraries reveals something fundamental about the nature of historical knowledge. What we think we know about the past is largely determined by what those in power chose to preserve. The Dark Ages appeared dark, not because they lacked intellectual achievement, but because intellectual achievement was systematically hidden from view. Modern archaeological techniques are beginning to reveal the true extent of what was lost. Chemical analysis of monastery soil shows evidence of large-scale book burning. Digital imaging of palimpsests reveals traces of erased texts that were too dangerous to preserve. Systematic examination of library inventories shows the patterns of selective destruction that characterized the Great Purge. But perhaps the most important discovery is that the knowledge wasn't completely lost. Fragments survived in hidden locations, in private collections, and in the oral traditions of communities that were driven. The ideas that were too dangerous to preserve in the official libraries were kept alive by people, understood their value, and were willing to risk persecution to maintain them. The story of the vanished libraries is ultimately a story about the power of knowledge. The books that were destroyed weren't just collections of information. There were repositories of possibilities, descriptions of alternative ways of organizing society, and evidence that human beings are capable of creating more just and equitable systems. Understanding this mystery changes how we think about the relationship between knowledge and power. It reveals that ignorance isn't a natural state that must be overcome through education. It's often a deliberately created condition that serves the interests of those who benefit from keeping others in the dark. The great knowledge purge of the Dark Ages wasn't just a historical tragedy. It was a template for how information can be controlled and suppressed in any era. As we move into our final segment, we'll explore how this systematic suppression of knowledge affected the daily lives of people at the very top of medieval society. We'll discover that even the wealthy and powerful were trapped within the system they had helped create, and that the cover-ups we've been exploring had consequences that extended far beyond their intended targets. The truth about medieval aristocracy reveals yet another layer of the Great Deception. The Golden Cage, life among the medieval elite, and the prezzo of power. For our final exploration into the dark secrets of the Dark Ages, we turn our attention to a world that might seem like paradise compared to the grinding poverty we witnessed in our first segment. This is the world of the medieval aristocracy, the lords and ladies who lived in stone castles and never worried about where their next meal would come from. But as we'll discover, this apparent luxury came with a price that few modern people would be willing to pay. The medieval elite weren't just the beneficiaries of the system we've been exploring. They were also its prisoners. Picture yourself waking up in a grand castle on a foggy morning in the year 952 CE. Daughter of a powerful duke, married to another duke, and one of the wealthiest women in what will someday be called the Holy Roman Empire. Your bed is draped with silk imported from Constantinople. Your walls are decorated with tapestries that took years to create, and your breakfast will include delicacies that most people will never taste. But as you open your eyes, your first thought isn't about luxury. It's about survival. Because even at the pinnacle of medieval society, life was a constant struggle against forces that could destroy you. The wealth and power that surrounded you weren't guarantees of security. They were simply different types of prisons, golden cages, that offered comfort. Your daily routine begins before dawn, not because you have work to do in the traditional sense, but because every moment of your life is scripted by obligations and expectations. You dress not in clothes that you choose, but in garments that signal your status, your allegiances. Every piece of jewelry you wear sends a message about your family's power. Every color and fabric choice has been dictated by sumptuary laws that specify exactly what people of your rank may and may not wear. The first meal of the day is a performance. You sit at a high table, elevated above the dozens of people who live in your castle, but this apparent power is largely illusory. The food you eat has been prepared by servants who could poison you at any moment. The people who serve you are potential spies, informants, and assassins. The very luxury that surrounds you is a constant reminder of how much you have to lose. Here's something that might surprise you about medieval aristocratic life. Despite all the wealth and apparent freedom, you have less personal autonomy. Your marriage was arranged when you were a child, chosen not for love or compatibility. Your children will be taken from you at a young age to be raised in other households, both as hostages for your good behavior and as pawns in future political games. Your daily activities, your social interactions, even your private thoughts, are all subject to constant scrutiny and control. The castle that serves as your home is also your prison. You cannot leave without permission, escort, and elaborate security arrangements. You cannot visit other noble families without complex negotiations about protocol. You cannot travel to the nearby town without triggering a massive disruption. As dozens of people rearrange their lives, the very wealth that isolates you from the struggles of common people also isolates you from the simple pleasures of human connection. Your husband, Duke Conrad, embodies the contradictions of medieval. He commands thousands of soldiers, controls vast territories, and has the power of life and death. But he spends most of his time in desperate anxiety, constantly worried about rebellions. He cannot trust his own soldiers, who serve him only as long as he can pay them. He cannot trust his own nobles, who are constantly looking for opportunities to advance their own interests. He cannot even trust his own family, because inheritance law means that his brothers, his sons, and even his wife might have reasons to want him dead. The political dynamics of medieval aristocracy were extraordinarily complex and dangerous. Every social interaction was potentially a matter of life and death. A slight breach of protocol could trigger a blood feud that might last for generations. A misunderstood comment could be interpreted as treason. A failure to attend the right ceremonies or support the right causes could result in political exile, or worse. This is where the cover-ups we've been exploring throughout our journey become most apparent. The medieval aristocracy lived in a world built on systematic deception, not just about the past. They told themselves and others that their power was divinely ordained, that their wealth was justified by their superior virtue, and that their subjects were content. But the reality was far more precarious and morally ambiguous. The great secret of medieval aristocratic life was that it was built on a foundation of violence. Your wealth comes from the labor of peasants who have no choice but to serve you. Your power depends on the threat of punishment for anyone who challenges your authority. Your status requires the systematic suppression of any ideas or movements that might suggest alternative forms of social organization. But living with this knowledge creates a psychological burden that few people today can imagine. You are constantly aware that your comfort depends on the suffering of others. You know that your security requires the insecurity of everyone around you. You understand that your freedom depends on the systematic denial of freedom to the vast majority of people in your society. This psychological burden manifests in the elaborate rituals and ceremonies that dominate aristocratic life. The constant feasts, the elaborate clothing, the complex protocols of courtly behavior, all serve to create distance between you and the reality of how your lifestyle is maintained. They are forms of collective ways of avoiding the uncomfortable truth about what medieval aristocracy actually involved. The religious practices of the medieval elite reveal another layer of this deception. You attend Mass every day, donate generously to churches and monasteries, but these practices aren't expressions of genuine faith so much as they are attempts to purchase spiritual absolution for the violence and exploitation that your lifestyle requires. The Church provides a convenient narrative that justifies your position, while promising forgiveness for the sins that position necessitates. The educational system available to medieval aristocrats was carefully designed. You learned to read and write, but only in Latin, which separated you from the common people who spoke vernacular languages. You studied classical literature, but only selected works that supported existing power structures. You learned about history, but only versions that portrayed aristocratic rule as natural. The books in your private library, the ones that survived the Great Purge we discussed earlier, were carefully curated to exclude any works that might encourage you. You had access to poetry and romance, religious texts, and classical philosophy, but nothing that might suggest that ordinary people were capable of governing themselves, or that wealth could be distributed more equitably. This intellectual isolation had profound consequences for medieval aristocratic culture. Despite having access to education and leisure time, the medieval elite produced remarkably little innovative thinking about politics, economics, or social organization. They were trapped within conceptual frameworks that prevented them from imagining alternatives. The social life of medieval aristocracy was characterized by a strange combination of intimacy and mistrust. You lived in close quarters with dozens of other people, but you could never be certain of anyone's true loyalties. Your closest advisors might be plotting against you. Your dearest friends might be gathering information to use against you. Your own family members might be your greatest enemies. This atmosphere of constant suspicion created a culture of elaborate etiquette and formal behavior. Every gesture, every word, every expression had to be carefully calculated to avoid giving offense. Offense, or revealing weakness. Spontaneous emotional expression was dangerous, because it might be interpreted as instability. Genuine intellectual curiosity was risky, because it might lead to questioning established authority. The entertainment available to medieval aristocrats reflected these constraints. You enjoyed elaborate feasts, but they were more about displaying wealth and power than about genuine pleasure. You participated in tournaments and hunts, but these activities were training for war rather than recreation. You listened to music and poetry, but the content was carefully controlled to reinforce approved messages about honor, loyalty. Even your private relationships were shaped by political considerations. Your marriage was a treaty between families. Your friendships were alliances that could be broken if circumstances changed. Your relationship with your children was complicated by the knowledge that they might someday be your rivals or your successors. Love and affection were luxuries that you couldn't afford to indulge without considering their political implications. The medieval aristocracy lived in a world where information was power, but where too much of the wrong kind of information could be fatal. You knew more about politics, economics, and social organization than most people in your society. But you also knew that this knowledge came with responsibilities and dangers that could destroy you if you used it unwisely. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval aristocratic life. Despite having access to education, leisure, and resources, the medieval elite, they were capable of sophisticated thinking about military strategy, diplomatic negotiation, but they were incapable of imagining more just or equitable ways of organizing society. The cover-up that characterized medieval aristocratic life wasn't just about hiding uncomfortable truths from others. It was about hiding uncomfortable truths from themselves. The elaborate rituals, the complex protocols, the constant emphasis on honor and tradition all served to mask the reality that their entire way of life was built on violence and exploitation. As we conclude our journey through the dark secrets of the Dark Ages, we see how the systematic suppression of knowledge and alternatives affected every level of society. The peasants suffered under grinding poverty and deliberate ignorance. The revolutionary thinkers like Pelagius were silenced and erased from history. The great libraries were purged of dangerous ideas. And even the elite, who benefited from these systems, were trapped within them, unable to imagine or create better alternatives. The real darkness of the Dark Ages, it was the systematic prevention of civilizational progress. The period wasn't characterized by ignorance so much as by the deliberate cultivation of ignorance. The suffering wasn't inevitable, it was carefully maintained by those who benefited from it. Understanding these secrets changes how we think about our own time and our own possibilities. The systems we inhabit today aren't natural or inevitable any more than the systems of the Dark Ages were. The knowledge and alternatives that could help us create better societies might be suppressed. The question is whether we have the courage to seek them out and the wisdom to act. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history's greatest Whether you're drifting off to sleep or staying awake to contemplate these revelations, remember that understanding the past is the key to creating a better future. The darkness of the Dark Ages teaches us, and the possibility of change are precious gifts that must be constantly protected and cultivated. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be filled with visions of the better world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning. And keep believing that even in the darkest times, the light of human possibility continues to shine.